Hello, family. I'm Janaya Future Khan, and this is Dark Woke. Just before we begin, I want to say thank you to all the listeners out there, and a special shout out to all the supporters of the show. You make this possible. It means the world to me. If you'd like to become a supporter of Dark Woke, we'll have the Patreon linked in the episode right up below. Okay, this episode is all about the ceasefire. All about the ceasefire. Which ceasefire? Because there have been several at this point, none of which Israel has respected, not one time. We're going to talk about what the terms of the deal are, right? How we should feel about it, and most importantly, is this good for the Palestinian people, right? But before we jump, I just got to say, the entire media economy bending over backwards and doing mental gymnastics to refer to Trump as some kind of peace president is nauseating. Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump, who unleashed ICE on regular American citizens, that uses, right, Homeland Security and the borders as some kind of prison gate. The alligator Alcatraz guy. What about the guy, right, that threw away 94 million pounds of food that is no longer going to be in food banks across America just because his administration could? That's your peace president? Donald Trump is a peace president is like calling Jeffrey Dahmer, right, the leader of the anti-obesity campaign, because he said one day, "I'm full." Okay? This is deeply unserious. This is deeply unserious behavior. More importantly, we have no reason to believe, not a single reason to believe, that Israel or Netanyahu is going to honor this, ceasefire deal for any reason, because they never have, right? They never have. They never, not once have. We've had, this is the third one, though you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know it based on what Donald Trump is saying. It's the third ceasefire deal we've had. Now, there are a couple of changes, and one in particular that I think is significant, but we are going to get there, right? So first and foremost, right, Netanyahu. I don't want to talk about this guy. In fact, before we get into things, I do have to say, this episode is really hard for me. This was a difficult episode to put together because I don't even know how to articulate the level of You know what? I feel embarrassed. I feel embarrassed that this is considered a win. I feel embarrassed that the left had nothing to do with this or has seen any wins. Like, we haven't seen a single win that was meaningful. And that doesn't mean that this is not important, especially as we break down what is significant for the Palestinian people now. I am just a little bit grossed out that work is happening related to Palestine. Interventions are happening related to Palestine because, again, it's America that's bankrolling the genocide against Palestinians. And here's another thing that's happened that we've had no hand in shaping, right? So I am a spectator, and you are a spectator, because we simply have not built any kind of meaningful power in order to actually help shape and inform the experiences that we are funding for other people around the world, right? We can't even properly intervene in what is happening to people here in America where we live, where we are powerful, or could be if we made a couple of changes. Now, I'm not just going to sit here and bitch about it. We're building that change, right? We are. There is a sleeping giant that's starting to stir. But if we aren't willing to do things differently and lose the riffraff, I worry. I worry about, it's easy, I think, to critique power. It's easy to sit back and say, this is not good enough. And you want to know something? I felt that way. I really did. I still feel that way. And at the same time, the hubris, right? 2,000 Palestinians have been freed from prisons. 2,000, right? That each and every one of those people are as unique and full of dreams and love and ambition and have family just like you and I do. And yet somehow we keep reducing these folks to a number. And it's easy to say, well, how could this be a win? But for every person released, it is, right? for the person who was facing 2 to 3 decades for a stolen bike, that kind of bullshit, right? Who ended up serving, 3 years instead of 17, that's a win, right? For the family that got to hug that person and hold that person and see them again, because Israel disappears people. That they're exceptional at disappearing people. That's what they do. That's what an apartheid state does. So the question is, does this ceasefire change the apartheid state? No, not in the slightest, right? So if there's anybody out there that is feeling as complex as a series of emotion as I'm feeling, just know you're not alone. And it is so important, I think, to remind ourselves of Palestinians as actual people and not as a political point to make, a thing to measure, the Biden administration or the Trump administration. No, these are people. These are human beings. And I am frustrated with how decentered that becomes in the left as a whole, because I think then the conversation wouldn't have been, oh, Kamala's just the same as Donald Trump and the Biden administration is the same. It doesn't really matter. And if that is in fact true, right, what did you do about it? What did we do? What did abstaining from voting do? What did, and this isn't even to blame those folks, because I have illustrated in this episode already, right? Not in this episode, in several others. But you know what? I think we got rid of it. So this is a great time to remind folks that I did the math. Every single person who didn't vote wouldn't have made a lick of difference. Just based on the numbers, folks who abstained from voting, every single one of those folks could have voted and it wouldn't have made a difference. Trump still would have won. So this isn't because they failed. It's us as a collective. And I just had to break my timeline that I do now, because I was struggling today. I was really struggling, not just because, we love a tangent over here. I was struggling because I was like, what does this do, right? What does talking about this more do? If this is what the work is, this is part of it, because this is where we've also lost, then it's just simply not enough work. And I think that's it. I think that's the conclusion that I'm drawing. I want to do more work. This is simply not enough work. I'm dissatisfied with the level of output that we have as the left. I'm dissatisfied. So, knowing that, I decided instead to spend more time reading about families being reunited than I did about scoring political points, which I think is a good thing for us all to remember. And ask ourselves, or let me ask you, aren't you pissed off that it's the Trump administration that's saying that they scored this big ceasefire deal, right? And listen, I'm going to shred that deal to pieces, right? But isn't that frustrating? That knowing what this administration believes, knowing that there was something insidious behind the scenes that had to take place to force Netanyahu to participate. And again, this is not the end, not even close, right? What this ceasefire is, and now let's get into it, okay? So I'm going to tell you how it happened, what it entails, and why Netanyahu is the biggest bitch on the planet, and what he's going to do to fight this tooth and nail every step of the way. So what happened, right? So over the weekend, Trump decides he's going to go out. He's going to fly out to Egypt, and he's going to sign a peace deal, right? He's going to bend Netanyahu's arm as much as he possibly can, and he's going to secure this peace deal. And, there's a backstory here, which we may or may not get into a bit later, where Trump just, woke up one day and decided he wanted a Nobel Peace Prize. And then this became a priority, but, we've got time for that. So let me break down what happened. So the weekend he goes out to Egypt, he signs the peace deal. Do you know who's not there? Benjamin Netanyahu, right? Benjamin Netanyahu did not decide to join the event, even though Trump tried quite a bit to bend his arm and force him into compliance. Netanyahu was like, nah, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to sign this thing. I don't feel like I should have to. So who else is there? You've got the president of, the Arab Republic of Egypt. You've got the emir of the state of Qatar, right? And you've got the president of the Republic of Turkey. So that's who goes. The thing gets signed. They call it Trump's peace deal, right? And the question is Benjamin Netanyahu going to honor it, right? So I was like, what was his response? What was his response? While Trump was standing in front of the Knesset, which he did, and saying, this is a new day. You don't get to do what you want to do anymore, right? And listed in this ceasefire deal are 20 points. 20 points, that's a lot of points. Now, there is one thing that makes this ceasefire deal different than all the others, right? The last two that failed. And only one, major one, that there was a changeover of people. This is something that has not been possible prior to now. So, however many remaining hostages living, and I think 4 that are deceased, the bodies of those folks, were transferred over back to Israel. Okay? 2,000 people, right? Prisoners of war is actually the term, right? I want to be clear about something. Prisoners of war, political prisoners, hostages. Israel has been collecting Palestinian people and throwing them in jails for no reason for decades, including children, right? I want to remind you of when Israelis protested in Israel for the right to rape prisoners, okay? I want to remind us of this. It's just a horrendous thing to say. But that is what happens in an apartheid state. So Israel gets the hostages back. 2,000 Palestinians are released. This is something that has not been possible prior to. This is a deal point that did not happen in any other ceasefire arrangement. And that is significant. And I don't know that it goes further than that, if I'm just going to keep it a buck. Because Netanyahu's response, and I want to be clear, it didn't, like, we have a ceasefire deal, which means that the war, and I'm using air quotes here because there's no war. It's an entire state and one of the greatest military superpowers in the world, thanks to the United States, against Palestinian people in an open air prison. So they're not going to be bombing the shit out of Gazans and Palestinians anymore openly. They're not going to be firing on people who are trying to receive food aid in a way that we can cover or see, or they will be in violation of the ceasefire deal, which is pretty much how they have violated every ceasefire deal. So the question is this different for Netanyahu, or is Israel more enthusiastic about this deal than ever before? Because whether or not any sitting administration here has wanted a ceasefire deal is not really in question versus Israel, right? It's been America that's been pushing for some kind of peace brokerage, regardless of how critical we are of those people. That you're not going to hear me contest. I don't care about that. It's mainly that it's Israel that's like, no, every time. No, we're not doing it. So I look into it. Netanyahu's response, and this is per CNN's reporting, is, when Trump was giving this like long-winded speech to the Israeli Knesset, which is their Congress, their parliament, he shouted out Benjamin Netanyahu for having the, quote, guts to recognize the time was right to end his 2-year war, when actually Netanyahu did no such thing. In fact, right, he refused to attend the deal signing, no matter how much Trump tried to force him to. And then he didn't affirm anything that Donald Trump said in his speech, right? He said, I am committed to this peace, but neither he nor Trump offered any clues about what is going to happen for the next phase of negotiations, which is where things tend to fall apart, right? What do you do? What do you do with what do we do with what we know? What do we do with the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu has set up Hamas as a terrorist organization with the aid of every American administration, when in fact that was Palestinians' political leadership? And if we go back and do the math, right, Hamas wasn't even the leadership that Palestinians wanted. Benjamin Netanyahu made that choice, right? They wanted the Palestinian Authority. But remember that Palestinians haven't had an election since 2008, right? Israel has stopped them from doing so. So every single thing that Israel has experienced has to do overwhelmingly with Israel's own hands shaping it, the good and the bad, the ugly and horrific, right? And its expansion. Benjamin Netanyahu has been at the heart of it. You know what's interesting? There is because I was going to go over all the points of the deal, and I realized I don't need to, because nothing else matters except these questions. Can Gaza be rebuilt? And if so, by whom and how? Will Israel cede any of the land that they stole? Right? We're talking about Gaza, but also they have expanded their illegal settlements across the West Bank. Right? And will Palestine be recognized as an independent state? Those are the questions that matter. And at present, this is what we know. Right? In order to know where you're going, you got to know a little bit about where you're coming from. We don't have to go far back for this. Benjamin Netanyahu has been such a warmongering, horrendous, hideous human being that he has prolonged this war and its effort at every possible chance that he's gotten to save his own political career. How do I know that what I'm saying is true? Do you know that the New York Times is probably one of the most virulent, I got it, almost? Virulent. Damn. You know what? One of you is saying that the right way, and you need to send me a voice note and tell me, okay? But they have been so pro-Israel this entire time, right? Like just unbelievably pro-Israel. That's been the media bias in the New York Times. Even the New York Times had to write a damning, right, expose in July 2025 of all the ways that Benjamin Netanyahu has worked tirelessly since October 7th, 2023 to prolong the war as long as possible. He could have gotten those hostages back in weeks. He could have gotten them back in days. It was never about the hostages. It was never about the safety of Israelis. It was never about Palestinians. We know that. It wasn't even really about Hamas. It was always about his political career. And his response to this ceasefire deal is consistent with how he's responded to everything related to Israeli apartheid and Palestinian genocide. He's going to keep doing what he wants to do because, and this is where there's a parallel between America and Israel, because well, God knows they're certainly in bed together. There are other players in the game when it comes to the Knesset and Israel and what Benjamin Netanyahu does or doesn't do. Now, I want to be clear, he is an extremist in every sense of the word. Benjamin Netanyahu believes overwhelmingly in Palestinian genocide. But I want to remind you of Trump's first administration in 2016, right? In his first administration in 2016, he wasn't as effective, was he? Do you want to know why Trump wasn't as effective in seeing through his agenda? Because he didn't have consolidated power. He didn't have a consolidated power base, and he worked tirelessly to get that, right? And what we saw in those years, from his first administration to his second, is that the fringe players, the most extreme people, right? And back then, those players happened to be, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, they were like too freaky, right? Ted Cruz was a bit of a joke, right? That little goblin man, Stephen Miller, was a bit of a pariah, right? Homan was not a thought on people's minds in any meaningful way. But what you saw, and what we've seen in the past several years, since 2016 to now, is that the most extreme version of the right has sort of hijacked the entire GOP. And that's not because they didn't want to be hijacked, or they're not some innocent sitting body. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they built their power, right? And while that was happening, because that's the job of extremism, is to seize power, right? And for your own particular agenda. The same thing was happening in the Knesset in the last several years, right? We've seen extreme factions become the status quo. And in this, we should see the necessary points of intervention and what happens when we don't stop the consolidation of power across the right. So back in 2024, right? Benjamin Netanyahu has this this opportunity. This is 6 months after our October 7th, 2023, right? So at that point in time, the proposal, the ceasefire proposal on the table would have paused Israel's assault on Gaza for 6 weeks, right? This would have created a window of negotiations for Hamas and had allowed space for a permanent truce, right? In that deal, more than 30 hostages captured by Hamas at the start of the war would have been released within weeks, right? That was it. And then more would have been freed if that truce was extended. And the devastation of Gaza, right? 2 million people trying to survive daily attacks. That would have come to a halt because we're going to, once again, talk about the devastation that's happened in Gaza, not simply the fact that 67,000 people were slaughtered, right? That we know that 9 out of 10 buildings have been razed to rubble, and we really break that down in the last episode we've done, and I encourage you to check that out, 2 years after the fact, commemorating October 7th, right? What else would have ending the war back then, April 2024? What would have done? And again, the war. Can we please be serious? Right? Ending Israel's assault on Gaza, right? Would have been able to broker a peace deal with Saudi Arabia. That's the Arab world's most powerful country. So for months, Saudi leadership signaled a willingness to accelerate peace talks with Israel, right? You might remember this. This is before Iran, right? As long as the war that Israel was perpetrating against Gazans would stop. This normalization of ties between the Saudi government, right, and the Israeli government, which, by the way, is something no sitting Israeli leader has ever achieved since its founding in 1948, and again, when Plymouth Rock fell onto Palestinians, but it would have secured Israel's status in the region. Isn't that what they said this whole thing was about? Safety for Israelis? Yeah, it turns out peace is the best way to do that, but it's not really the primary goal of Israel, right? Expansion is, and eradication of anyone that is not Jewish and it is not Israeli is key to this plan, which is the world is still not being fully honest about, right? So that could have happened all the way back then in April 2024, right? But that's not what happened, and you might ask yourself, why? Well, let me take you back in time, right? Back to when Benjamin Netanyahu, see, at that time, his government wasn't so strong because nobody liked him, because people understood that the reason why Hamas attacked in the way that it did, and again, right, what is it that Trump is always saying? What is it that Biden has always said? What is it that every president has always said every time that they're in office, right? Defend the American people. That's what they talk about. That's what your political party is supposed to do, right? And yet, Hamas is a terrorist organization. And yet, Hamas, who Palestinian people themselves, who Palestinian people themselves did not want, is a terrorist organization for trying to defend its people? Huh. Funny how that happens, that framing, right? But anyway, Benjamin Netanyahu led a very fragile coalition in the Knesset. He needed far-right ministers who wanted to occupy Gaza, not withdraw from it. Right? Starting to sound a little bit familiar. Trump had to consolidate his power base in order to win again because he lost. He lost and then decided that he was never going to lose again when he lost in 2020, right? So they got in bed with the most extreme factions, of which Trump himself partially represents. That's how that works. Same thing can be said with Netanyahu, right? So they get into this whole thing, and then Smotrich becomes a key player in this. Now, this guy is the finance minister of Israel, and I'm going to tell you something. He's a fucking disgusting monster of a human being, right? He is one of the strongest advocates in the cabinet, right, in the Knesset for reestablishing settlements alongside, just like settlements everywhere, just a complete annexation of Palestinian land and territories alongside, Ben Gvir, and that's the far-right national security minister, right? So these are the guys who said, hey, Gaza's Palestinian population should leave. They should leave now. Do you remember when we were hearing that a few weeks ago and months ago, and then every time like something else happens? Yeah, these are the guys that are helping to lead that, right? So Smotrich said to Benjamin Netanyahu at that time during his fragile government, when this peace deal was on the table, that would have completely transformed, right, what the conditions that exist now. We would have been in a different reality, plagued by the same monstrosities, but not to the extreme levels that they have. More people would be alive, is what I'm saying. And I want you, the way that I am, to think of all the points of intervention that we were not participant to. Because that's our job, right? That's our job. But anyway, Benjamin Netanyahu listens to Smotrich when Smotrich says, I want you to know that if a surrender agreement like this is brought forward, you no longer have a government. Smotrich said, the government is finished. That is a direct quote, right? So what Benjamin Netanyahu promised in 2024 of April, right, when there was this great deal on the table, that there would be no ceasefire plan. He said, quote, no, there's no such thing. He said, and the cabinet discussion moved on, right? So what happened? Netanyahu leans over to his security advisors and whispered what was already obvious to them. He, quote, don't present the plan. You want more? Go ahead and read up on the New York Times extensive reporting on this. And again, I want to remind you that in order for them to, the tilt, the media bias that the New York Times has embodied throughout this entire thing, in order for them to write this, it means that it is so factually true that they had no choice but to report on it. And not only was it factually true, but it was demanded by the public, right? So it's called How Netanyahu Prolonged the War in Gaza to Stay in Power. And he did. So what happened after that? We ended up getting 12 days of missiles with Iran. And this was in June. And every American president has said this at some level, and we know this as a public, and Noam Chomsky has written about this extensively. How does a president or a prime minister or anyone stay in power? Start a war. Start a war. Start a war. Make the people afraid, right? Drum up a sense of patriotism, and that's exactly what happened. It also made it so that people in the West, Americans in particular, would be like, well, look, Israel they just can't get a break. They're the only white people out there. right? They're the only white people out there, and those dangerous Arabs, even though half the time the Israeli population swears up and down that they are not in fact white, which is really funny. I'm like, you've banned Ancestry.com, 21andMe. You just banned those things that show over and over again European ancestry, but whatever, right? They said don't present the plan. The plan didn't get presented. Now we have a war with Iran. Benjamin Netanyahu capitalizes on the fear that he created. Do you get what I'm saying? Israelis were like, hey, you're not freeing my loved one from Hamas. This is not a priority for you. A lot of the families of the hostages realized, right, that Benjamin Netanyahu didn't give a shit about their family members and so started to protest against them. Well, I think that it is highly probable that certain areas of the Iron Dome suddenly experienced weaknesses that they'd never experienced before because, well, they said it was impenetrable, but a lot of those Iranian missiles made some kind of contact. But I want to be clear about something. When I say a lot, I mean a handful. And on the outskirts, where nobody was really hurt, which is wild considering how it was reported, right? Wild. But the Israelis get afraid. And they say, yeah, we need somebody strong. We need a firm hand, right? We need a firm hand. So he has a comeback. He has a comeback from October 7th, 2023, right? Where Benjamin Netanyahu oversaw the greatest and deadliest military failure in Israel's short history. And I want to be clear. It's a really short history. It makes you think maybe it wasn't a failure. Maybe it was more orchestrated than we know, since everything that has happened in Israel has been orchestrated by Israel, or very much in large part by Israel, right? Again, Hamas was hand-selected, something that we seem to keep forgetting in American media. Anyway, while this is happening, Gaza has been flattened. This is back in 2024, right? At that point, we have 55,000 people who have been murdered by the Israeli government, including Hamas, members and combatants. But I mean, to say that it was overwhelmingly civilian simply does not capture it. No, not overwhelmingly civilian. It was civilians who were murdered. And a couple of Hamas leaders. That's it, right? Of that 55,000 who were murdered, at least 10,000 of them were children, right? At least 10,000 were children under the age of 11. That means there were more children, but at least 10,000 of that 55,000 were under the age of 11. They're children, right? So while this is happening, more time goes on. Israel is losing favor. Sure, they were able to drum up a little bit of success with Iran and how they responded to that. In the Western imagination, we were all just like, can these bitches take a break? Like, just starting wars with everybody. What is going on, right? But in the media, it's like, well, Israel has a right to defend itself. They were still talking about that. But as time goes on and we learn more and more about the children, and it is because of the tireless work of Palestinians that are bolstered up by, Gen Z on TikTok, by people posting, by, political leaders, not the establishment, talking about it endlessly. And that is why it is so important that we can't just roll back and say, what we do is not enough, or I can't even engage in this. It's simply not enough. As long as there is a Palestinian fighting and breathing in Palestine, we have an obligation to fight in every possible way that we can. Every possible way, every single way that we can. And we have failed to do that in the ways that it matters most, to be perfectly honest with you. Those policies that we roll our eyes at, that's where these things are written into law and then executed. I mean, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that because that's not how I was brought into this. work. I did not know that. To sit here now, all these years later, right? And really just 2 years of the hardest kinds of reflecting on, which is our failure to protect human beings as the left, is that Palestine was a policy issue, understanding that now. In addition to the ethical, the philosophical, all the other things, the socio, the economic, whatever, right? We love to talk about the economic side of it. But it was a policy issue, and that's where we failed. And that's where we continue to fail. Right? So, the sympathy that Israel garnered in its back and forth with Iran kind of dies out because they keep murdering children. They keep murdering parents. They keep murdering doctors and journalists and food relief, aid workers, right? They just keep murdering people, right? The International Court of Justice weighs in, right? They're deciding on whether or not this is in fact a genocide. Of course, we know that it is. At the time, right, we had Joe Biden in his last term. I mean, like, his last, like, it's just a walking corpse. He could have sneezed and he would have spontaneously combusted by then, but 2024, he's still the guy. And his failure to end the war splits the Democratic Party in half, right? And it helped to create a moment that saw Trump's return to power, right? Whether or not that would have happened, we can't say for sure, but we did not have any consolidated base on any level, right? And I think that's where the next iteration of this fight needs to happen, is what would it look like if we consolidated our power? But anyway, that's to say that is merely one example, just one example where Netanyahu actively chose not to. That piece details an unbelievable amount of opportunities where Benjamin Netanyahu could have ended Israel's attack on Gaza. They just don't care. It's not about ending Israel's attack on Gaza. And really, a lot of what's happening now has to do with Trump's weird obsession with the Nobel Peace Prize. I have no idea why. I trying to understand the logic of one of the craziest megalomaniacs out there is a waste of time. Other than he seems concerned about legacy a little bit. But what I don't want this to overshadow is what this moment means for the Palestinian people and the families that were reunited. This fight is far from over. We have no reason to believe this. I want to be clear. This is a ceasefire that is specific to warfare in Gaza. This has not ended Israeli apartheid, nor has it ended the framing that in American media that is calling it the Israel-Hamas war. That's not over. That's not done, right? And so we have to understand that our fight is still very much ongoing. I'm having, and I hope that this episode is making sense because I'm processing this. I woke up furious. I couldn't really figure out why. And as I started to unpack this episode, it was revealed to me I'm embarrassed by our powerlessness, which is a choice in this era, and one that is being changed, right? And I had to remind myself to be moved by what this means for Palestinian folks who are reunited. Whether or not we had the hand in shaping this that we should have, one of the most brutal one-sided attacks in human history has ended, even if it's temporary. And that means something to the people who have enduring it. It might not mean as much to us, but that's because we get to sit back and talk about how this makes us feel. Right? So, the questions that I posed, it might be good to think about those now. Will Gaza be rebuilt, right? Because I know we got to wrap this, and I like to be a happier chap. I'd like to be a happier chap, but in this moment, I can just feel all the all the not enough of this and hold the fact that it is a victory for the people of Palestine because the world gave them nothing. The world gave them nothing, and they won this. They won this. Their refusal to give up, their refusal to surrender, their desire to live in love, to their belief in their right to return, their love of their homeland, right? So the question again is, can Gaza be rebuilt? Now, we talked about how buildings have been reduced to rubble. The vast majority of the infrastructure in Gaza, hospitals, schools, everything, real life, regular life can't be maintained in its current state. People have been starved, some to death, right? So here's what I can tell you about that. First, I want to locate us in what this meant to Palestinians, and then I'm going to talk about how other nations are committing to rebuilding Gaza and what may stop that effort, okay? Palestinian political prisoners who were released flashed victory signs to cheering crowds on Monday, right? They stepped into freedom for the first time, some of them in years, right? Israeli prisons are where people go to be disappeared, never to be seen again, right? Families were waiting at dawn in the West Bank, in Ramallah, right? A beautiful place. And they cried, and they came up in you know, the newly released Palestinian folks came up in buses, right? Carrying nearly 2,000 people. So they rushed forward, and of course, what we know is that the vast majority of these detainees are who? Men, right? Men. That is on purpose. Killed children to ensure that the next generation doesn't survive and remove the people who could protect them. That is just genocide and apartheid 101. Women and mothers, their priority will be to keep their children safe. Kill the children. Bury the men. So they get reunited, right? Men are described as looking haggard and exhausted. I wouldn't use those words. They've endured torture and torturous conditions, right? Israel even did Greta bad. Greta Thunberg, you know, she got the most. She is truly the most well-known, internationally well-known leftist that we have, right? Israel abducted her and tortured her. She made sure that the media stayed true to focusing on Palestinians, but they were willing to do that to one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. What do you think they did to Palestinians that no one's ever heard of? Nasser Shahada, right, who was released after serving 3 years of a 17-year sentence, said this feeling is indescribable, right? He was not expecting to be freed ever. So this is a real thing that is worthy of pause and consideration, right? Wouldn't we like to have a hand in shaping the reuniting of families? Isn't that something that we would want some sort of hand in check? Doesn't it infuriate you that Donald Trump, or even fuck it, whatever, but like it didn't happen under these circumstances, but the Biden administration or even the Harris administration that would be more impactful than us? It doesn't matter if they're the ones who, at the end of the day, rubber stamp it, because we know what we did, but we didn't do enough this time around. And I think, you know, what you're hearing is my anger and frustration at our lack of power, right? And I'm going to fix this tonight, but it is overshadowing this moment for Palestinian people, and I'm going to keep trying to correct that. Because here's the thing that the right does really well, and then I want to move into whether or not Palestine can be rebuilt and what's and really specifically Gaza and what's stopping it. And we'll wrap it there. But, the right just makes shit up. Did you know that? Yeah, I know you knew that. But what I mean is, they just say anything, but then they make it true, right? They make it true. And at first, it seems so absurd or so ridiculous that we laugh at it or we ignore it, right? But repetition works. They say it with, they said it with, migrants. They're criminals. They're this and that. They said it. Haitians are eating the cats and dogs, right? Black people are lazy and criminal and this and that, right? Deviant, but you repeat it enough times, and then it gets repeated over and over and over again. And they own the most well-funded propaganda machine, right, in America. Across the board. I'm talking about alternative and traditional media, right? But that's not why they're winning. That's not why they're winning. Or at least it's not simply the only reason. They fight to make it true. So right now, we want to roll our eyes and laugh. I mean, I can't tell you. My eyes, what is it? My eyes rolled so far back, you know what I mean? I saw God when he was about this high, right? So far back my eyes rolled about that Nobel Peace Prize thing. But then, so we laugh about it, but then what happens? This, right? This happens. And then the framing, Trump is the peace president, and the repetition will happen over and over and over again. And I'm thinking as we consolidate the left, what things can we say and then make true, right? What if because the things that we fight for are pretty fucking good. They're universally good. They're true. When we say things like the rich already have socialism or whatever, we spend so much time walking back our politics for fear of, having to own it or fight, that we just don't say the things enough, and we don't say them enough of us. And so that is something that we have to change, undoubtedly. So, can Gaza be rebuilt? That's the question. Arab nations, right, including Saudi Arabia, are saying that they could do it. They would be willing to rebuild Gaza. It's important for them to do it. They're committed to doing it. It's just that they don't know if Benjamin Netanyahu is going to allow them to do that without burning everything to the ground. That is the major obstacle to Gaza being rebuilt. Tell me that's not disgusting, right? So, because this is what we're up against. This is what we're up against. Arab leaders have to bankroll Gaza and improve their diplomatic ties with Israel. That's a really difficult task, right? They wouldn't even, Benjamin Netanyahu wouldn't even show up to this ceasefire deal, right? This peace deal. I'm using heavy air quotes there, bunny ears, right? And it would take an incredible amount of wealth to rebuild this devastated strip of land, right? So they won't do that until they get assurances that Israel won't restart its bombing campaign, which is what they've done for every previous ceasefire, right? So leaders, that's including Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's the de facto ruler of the most powerful Gulf state, because it's just the Gulf is made up of different nations, but Saudi Arabia is the strongest, right? They want very, very firm signals, right, that a process was underway that would result in an eventual Palestinian state. That would require buy-in from Netanyahu, and he's been unwilling to provide that, even under pressure from Donald Trump. So whether or not Gaza can be rebuilt is not in question. It absolutely can. It's whether or not Israel will allow it to be rebuilt, and they will not. So I think we've seen the absolute limit of Trump's power. I want you to think about this, right? How much power Israel has over America. We have the most authoritarian, theocratic, fascistic administration in the history of the country, right? Openly so. doesn't give a shit about precedent, about the Constitution, about its relationship to other countries. It's burned bridges with America's closest allies, right? It's done it with everyone. Canada, the UK. Everybody can get that smoke. And yet, you telling me Trump couldn't even get that bitch nigga Netanyahu over to Egypt? That's telling. That this was the first complete affirmation that I have of it's not simply a matter of our Democratic presidents are weak. AIPAC and the Israeli lobby own American Congress through and through, even under a fascistic authoritarian regime. And by the way, I think that America will keep consolidating its power. I think that if we make a big stink when Israel, ultimately violates the ceasefire deal, which they will, it might force more action because the vanity of a narcissistic, megalomaniac and what actions they're willing to take to preserve their image is unmatched. But this guy also has dementia. I don't know if he remembers what he says half the time. So if we keep leaving what happens in the hands of the small, putrid hands of the absolute worst people on the planet, this is where we end up. And I can't do that anymore. I'm actually I refuse. I'm so not okay with any of this. I know I'm not the only one. I know there's so many, because I'm not even seeing people post about this. I'm like, oh, we're all so fucking pissed off and disgusted and embarrassed, and it's all at once. And it matters that 2,000 people got free. It matters. Because this whole thing is for Palestinian people. And we can never, ever lose sight of that. At this point, though, we've got to do more, or I don't think we can say we believe what we say. I don't think we can say we are who we say we are if we aren't willing to study from our mistakes and try every strategy and different strategies. And look, there are so many ways to tackle this problem. You don't need to do the one that makes you the sickest. But you better not get in the fucking way of it anymore. Because this new iteration of leftist movement that's coming, we don't have time for that. We're fighting under fascism, So I am sitting here with you, confused about how to feel in the long term. But for tonight, for today, I'm going to continue to read more stories of Palestinian folks who have been released. I'm going to continue to follow what's happening there. I'm going to continue to be a champion of the cause for a free Palestine and an independent state. And I think I want us to continuously remind ourselves, right? Because I don't hear this enough. I think we did this in an episode way back about how important it is to support the Palestinian economy. Not just sitting there talking and saying, this is, we have to care about the people of Palestine. There's a country there. There's a country there. And so if I'd ask for anything moving forward, it's that we use the words Israeli apartheid, right? Not simply genocide as if it's happening in a vacuum. Is Israeli apartheid? The genocide is a result of the Israeli apartheid. So that's number one, Israeli apartheid. And a Palestinian state, right? Free Palestine is great, but I don't think people are understanding. I think they think of Palestine as the people. But the people of Palestine are dying in defense of their land. Palestine is a state. 3 of the, big Western countries have now acknowledged a Palestinian state. And so that is where our fight should evolve, right? Building power, naming Israeli apartheid, and not a war or a conflict, and fighting for an independent and free Palestine. That's it. Fighting for a Palestinian state. I think that's where we grow. And I'm going to keep reading about these 2,000 people. I'm going to keep doing my work. But today I woke up and I was just so angry at, and take this with a grain of salt because I don't mean this literally. Yeah, our like irrelevancy as a left. We represent every good, every fucking good that society can do us together, from education to healthcare, right? And we have allowed the absolute worst people in the country to hijack the country in the way that Israel has allowed the worst people in the country to hijack the country. And it's already a grotesque, it's founding the violence of it, the violence that created it. And we talked about that in depth, right? How so much of it always comes back to its roots in anti-Black racism. We have a new playbook, and it requires tactics for 21st century models of organizing. So, yeah, there'll be time for the little jokey jokes and the, but today I'm very, very, very reflective and grateful and more committed than ever. So this feels like a good note to jump on. I love you all very, very much. I'm so mad. Okay. I'm so mad. I love you all so much. I'm grateful for the space that we have. And just shout out to each and every one of you, the listeners of the show. Shout out to Corey, who had to endure me today, that poor man. And shout out to Whit, who makes this thing look great. I love y'all, and I can't wait to yap the next episode of Dark Woke. Peace. Love you.